All right, it's been a busy time, but we're going to get back into our study of Acts with chapter 14. This is going to conclude Paul's first missionary journey. We left off with him, I believe, at Iconium, and that's where we'll start chapter 14. And I'll be reading from the King James as normal. And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude both of Jews and also of the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil, affected against the brethren. A long time therefore abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, and part held with the Jews, and part with the apostles. And when there was an assault made both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers, to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were aware of it, and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about. This isn't going to be surprising or a departure from the pattern. Paul will come into a city, preach in the synagogue, win some converts, and then there's going to be some sort of divide or some sort of opposition, and he'll have to move on to the next city. So we move into Lystra and Derbe. The region's called Lycaonia. There's some question about who the book of Galatians is written to. There's a dispute about northern or southern Galatia, but a lot of scholars think that Lystra and Derbe would be those cities that are spoken of as Galatia. So when you think of Lystra and Derbe in the book of Acts, think of the Galatians. And if it's not that particular region, it's similar. So they escaped all of that. And verse 7 says, there they preached the gospel. Verse 8, and there sat a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet, and he leapt and walked. And this is very similar to what we see with Peter in Acts 3. It's interesting to see the parallels between Peter and Paul as we kind of shift our focus on Paul and his missionary journeys. Now, verse 11, when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. I happened to look at this earlier today for another reason, but in Hebrews 2:17, when it says Christ was made like us in all way, it's the same word that we read here. They thought that the gods had been made in the likeness of men. And I guess I understand people, not everyone understands or has studied Greek mythology, the idea of their multiple gods and who they were and what they were over. But throughout their mythology, they understood that gods would appear in human form. So when this miracle is worked, they superstitiously believe that these men who perform this miracle are gods. Verse 12 says they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius because he was the chief speaker. Jupiter and Mercury are the Roman names of these gods. The Greek and Roman gods are essentially the same with some differences in name. If you're familiar with the Greek names, we're talking about Zeus and we're talking about Hermes. But since Paul was the one who was doing most of the speaking, they thought he was the messenger. They thought Barnabas was like the head god or the chief god, according to their religion, their superstition. Then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands into the gates and would have done sacrifice with the people. So they wanted to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas because they thought they were gods, because they had healed this man. So completely misunderstood and misinterpreted what was going on. But now, I know this is an introduction study. I don't want to go too deep. But what's interesting about this, there is a myth that's recorded and it might have been known at this time and in this region specifically. There was a myth that these two gods, Jupiter and Mercury, Zeus and Hermes, had visited this region once in the guise of humans, visited a family who had offered them hospitality, and then the reason they visited was the rest were wicked. They were wiped out in a flood. But if you want to look that up on your own time, the myth is called Baucis and Philemon. Philemon, like the book of the Bible, but not connected at all. Philemon is just a common Greek name. Baucis is Baucis, and that's pretty much the gist of it. But it's fascinating that people in this region, if this myth was pervasive, would have known about it, and it makes sense. That's why they thought of Zeus and Zeus and Hermes, of Jupiter and Mercury, and that's why they said in their mind, we're going to offer sacrifice to them because they didn't want to be wiped out. They didn't want to face judgment. So part of it's just their mythology. They believed this kind of thing went on in their mythology. The gods took human form all the time. And so there's some superstition about it. There's some self-preservation about it. If this myth is in their mind, why they identified those two gods specifically. But I found that really fascinating, and it really helps understand like what they'd been taught and what they believed and where they were coming from with this. Now, it's not an excuse for it. It's just tradition, superstition, and ignorance, but really helps you understand the mindset of why these people did this. So verse 14, which when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out and saying, Sirs, why do you do these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. We start to see a parallel with what we'll see Paul say in Acts 17 when he speaks to the philosophers and idolaters there. In times past, God suffered all nations to walk in their own ways, in superstition and ignorance and that sort of thing. Verse 17, nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. It's hard for me not to look ahead and think of Acts 17. He gives to all life, breath, and all things. This is sort of maybe a primitive form of that, or maybe it's something he develops later in a more fuller sense. Or maybe he's just simplifying it because of the nature of the people, where he can speak a bit more philosophically and robustly in Athens. This is just me analyzing it. Verse 18, with these things scarce restrained, they the people that they had not done sacrifices to them. So even after saying all these things, it was hard to try to convince the people not to do this. And maybe that's something we need to think about. Like, it's hard for people to break habits. It's hard for people to change their worldview, regardless of what was done. Like, they could scarcely restrain them. They could scarcely get them to stop with this idea that they need to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. So fascinating instance, worth studying. It's fairly short, but moving on. Verse 19. There came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium. This is interesting because people from these other cities, these other places, are coming and following Paul and trying to cause problems, trying to attack him and get rid of him, even though he's already left Antioch and Iconium before. Reading on, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. There's a lot of speculation about this passage. Verse 20, howbeit as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So did they think he was dead, but he wasn't? And maybe he was like healed in some way, able to stand up. Some take it similar to the passage about Eutychus later on, where someone fell out a window, fell down as dead. Maybe Paul did die here. Maybe Paul received a certain vision at this point in time, tying in with, I think it's 2 Corinthians 12. Not for sure, but if there was a time when Paul, died or something was raised up, then this could be it. Though the language isn't clear enough to be dogmatic about it. There's nothing wrong with preaching that or someone teaching that. Just want everyone to be aware. They go from Lystra to Derbe, verse 21. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra, to Iconium, and Antioch. Again, returning to the very same cities that had chased after him and tried to, put him to death. Takes a lot of courage. I saw a quote yesterday. I don't know where it's from. Like, without courage, all the other virtues are meaningless. And I hate to just throw that out there off the cuff, but it is something to think about. Verse 22, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. And when they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. Don't want to overemphasize this passage, but from all these cities that he visited, it's most likely to understand that there's probably one congregation in each city. And then in every church and every congregation, they ordained elders. They ordained a plurality of elders. They didn't. People will argue about this, and people will read into this what their own idea of their church or their denominational government is. But it's safe to say there were a number of elders, more than 2 elders, in each congregation, according to just understanding this passage. The word church speaks of a congregation or a group of congregations in a region, or it speaks of the entire church in general, as far as Scripture is concerned. Any other way we use the word church today is not, a way they would have understood it. So we see an appointment of plurality of elders. He had gone through these cities preaching the gospel, establishing these churches, and then went back through to set them in order and ordain elders. Verse 24, and after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia, and thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work they had fulfilled. And when they were come and had gathered with the church, now this is Antioch on the mainland, like above Jerusalem, not the other Antioch, which is in Asia Minor. There are multiple cities named Antioch, but this is them in Antioch, not far from Jerusalem. I'm blanking on my geography, but it's where they started their missionary journey from. They started from Antioch, went to all these cities, this other Antioch, and then came back to that particular region. So after they returned, we reread 26 or 27. When they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. It's interesting how missionaries today still, when they come back from missionary journey, they typically come back and they want to show slides and talk about everything that happened. So it's completely a scriptural pattern. Verse 28, and there they abode a long time with the disciples. So they stayed here for a while, which sets the stage for Acts 15. The question and the dispute between Antioch and Jerusalem, the congregation of Antioch, the congregation of Jerusalem, if anyone else is involved in that, we'll see it next week, Lord willing. But that's Acts 14 in a nutshell, just a good introduction to the conclusion of Paul's missionary journey. To summarize that whole journey, he basically goes through all these cities, comes back through appointing elders, and then returns back to talk about how both Jew and Gentile, but ultimately the Gentiles have believed on the Lord and accepted his grace and all these things. Chapter 15 is going to be a lengthy study, a lot of things to talk about, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Thanks for your time and attention. Have a good day, and God bless.